Okay, so to tell us more about fossils and feathers, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Maria McNamara. She is a professor of paleontology in the School of Biological, Earth, and Environmental Science in UCC. And she studies fossils with powerful X-rays and lasers to understand how animals evolved color and how dinosaurs and birds evolved feathers. And actually, I know Maria because outside of lab, we used to sing in a choir together. But today she's going to focus on science and tell us all about her own research. So if we get Maria up now, it would be perfect. Okay, take it away, Maria.
Great. Thanks very much, Erin. Thanks also for the reminder that I used to have a social life and I used to have hobbies pre-COVID. We'll get there someday, I guess. So anyway, what I'm going to talk today is pretty much what Erin mentioned. I'm going to talk about fossil feathers, or actually, to be honest, most of the time, it just looks like fossil fluff. So I'm going to talk about fossil fluff and other stuff. And let's just get straight to it. Let's get talking about fossils. Now, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to exactly what a fossil is. So fossils are basically the remains of living creatures that, once they die, I'm sorry, this is the most delicate way I could actually broach this topic, but all good things come to an end, and like it or not, everything does kick the bucket eventually. Once that happens, and if the environment is, let's say, at the bottom of a lake or the sea, well then, our little dead horsey has a chance of becoming a fossil. Those dead remains, carcasses, they eventually rot away. You get left with the bones, the hard, skeletonized parts of the animal. They'll eventually get buried by successive layers of mud and sand and silt. And then, all things going well, those hard fossilized remains will get brought back up to the Earth's surface. That's fossilization in a nutshell. Now, of course, not every creature that has ever lived on our planet has been turned into a fossil. If that was the case, we would be absolutely inundated with fossils poking out of every single sedimentary rock on the planet. Becoming a fossil is actually fairly tricky, and you've got to be in the right place at the right time. What this basically means is, if you are an animal like a horse, or like earthworms, or flowers, or bees and flies, or garden snails, the chances are you're not going to become fossilized, because animals living on land have a very low fossilization potential. Environments on land tend not to be the places where you're suddenly going to get buried by a load of sand or mud. Instead, organisms that live in the water, that live in the oceans, that live in lakes and rivers, these have a much higher fossilization potential. But even there, not everything living in watery environments can be fossilized, because, to be honest, most of the organisms that we have on our planet don't have the kinds of tissues that can be fossilized. They don't have bones, they don't have shells, they don't have teeth. Things like jellyfish, for instance, have a very, very low chance of becoming turned into a fossil. So things that are fossils include animals without backbones, such as snails. Here's a fossil sea snail from the Carboniferous of Ireland. Such as trilobites, these very famous fossils from the Paleozoic era. These are relatives of modern day crabs and woodlice. Unfortunately, they're no longer with us. They went extinct. And also big marine reptiles such as plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and their terrestrial relatives, of course, the dinosaurs. Things that aren't fossils then include things such as archaeological implements, Iron Age swords. These are not fossils because they were not alive. They were never alive. A decaying carcass in a modern desert is not a fossil because it hasn't become entombed by sediment. And things such as crystals, Even though they're natural materials and can be very ancient, these are also not fossils because they were never alive. So fossils, in effect, are things that were once alive, that are almost always found in rocks of some sort, and that are millions of years old. If you're talking about things that are a few hundred or a few thousand years old, we tend to leave these to the archaeologists. Paleontologists tend to focus on evidence of life that's millions of years old. So people that study fossils then, of course, are called paleontologists. And, you know, for many of us growing up in the 80s or 90s, your vision of a paleontologist would have included some of these archetypes, all of which are men, may I add. Charles Darwin, probably the most eminent paleontologist we've ever had, the guy from Jurassic Park, and of course, Ross from Friends. Who can beat that? Well, nowadays, paleontologists today have actually changed quite a bit. And we're now much more diverse. We include lots of young women, and we do lots of different things. We don't just, you know, hack rocks with hammers to look for fossils, although we still do that. You can see Adrian there on the top left is actually hacking a rock with to find a fossil in the lab. But we also use various types of microscopes to study our fossils, various types of high-tech equipment, you know, scanning fossils using lasers and high-powered X-rays. We also do experiments. We simulate the fossilization process in the lab, and we do lots of analyses of modern-day animals to help us understand what we're seeing in the fossil record. So that's what paleontology looks like today, and that's my flavor of paleontology. If you think this is a talk listing off names of different dinosaurs, this is not that kind of talk. I am terrible with names. That is not my forte. So why are we spending public money actually studying fossils? You know, what kinds of questions can they answer? And this slide is just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we use fossils to try and understand. Things about the origins of life in environments like the black smoker that you see on the top left, to try and understand other major events that have defined life on our planet, such as mass extinctions, some of which we know have been triggered by meteorite impacts. We combine information nowadays from fossils with genomic information, from DNA, from microbial RNA, from proteins, to better understand the evolution of animals. We use engineering principles in biomechanics to understand how animals move, what they eat, how strong their jaws were. You know, I've mentioned fancy types of scanning techniques, and we even now can recover evidence of color from fossils to better understand their behavior and how ancient animals communicated with each other and how communication strategies have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. So where do we actually go if we want to find fossils? Well, you know, there are some obvious places. You go to where you can find rocks. This can include high mountains. Here's an example from a very famous fossil locality in Canada, the Burgess Shale. You can go to the beach. Here's an example of a huge ammonite on the seashore of Lyme Regis in the southeast of the UK. But we can also find loads of fossils here in Ireland. And these include things such as trilobites. These are little arthropods. The fossils usually are missing their legs because they're not mineralized, they're not skeletonized, they just drop off after the animal dies. But you find these in lots of Irish rocks. They're relatives of woodlice. We also find lots of fossil brachiopods, little clamshells in Irish rocks. We find lots of these beautiful web-like structures. These are bryozoans. These, remarkably, these are still with us today. Here's an example from Hookhead, County Wexford, where I was just a couple of days ago. We found lots of these beautiful fossils called crinoids. These little things, they look like polar mints. They form a long stack, just like a tube of polar mints actually. But they're actually little calcite plates from the stem and arms of a relative of a starfish. Think a starfish on a stalk. Other common Irish fossils include things like goniatites. Here, these hands, these are my little girl girl's hands as she's cradling very carefully a goniatite. And you find these in lots of limestone areas around the country. And last but not least, we find things like corals, evidence of warm, shallow waters and warmer climates than we have nowadays. And you know, you don't have to go to mountains, you don't have to go to quarries, you don't even have to go to the beach. Sometimes all you need to do is just look at the stone walls in your local area, like this wall here, and you can find fossils. If you live in an urban area, you can find them just in the building stones of, you know, of the banks, of the libraries, of just some random shops on the street. This photograph was actually taken from the gutter in North Main Street in Cork City. So you find fossils literally in the gutters if you just keep your eyes peeled. So where's the fluff, and where does fluff come into all of this? Well, all the fossils I've shown you so far have been fossils of hard parts of animals, the resistant parts that aren't readily degraded by bacteria. These are normally the parts that can survive and become fossils, the bones, the shells, the teeth, the hard parts. Believe it or not, those are not the kinds of fossils that I'm interested in. I'm actually interested in the softer, squishier parts. And you might say, but you told us, Maria, you told us that they can't fossilize. Well, actually, I told a white lie. They do, sometimes. One of the most famous examples of fossil soft parts is the ancient bird Archaeopteryx. It's from the Jurassic, initially found in the site of Solnhofen in Germany, but there are several specimens that are known from around Germany and also the UK. And these, you know, are some of the most famous fossils that we have because they are the oldest bird that is known. And as the oldest bird, they preserve a remarkable mixture of features that we associate with modern birds, but also features that we associate with dinosaurs. So for instance, they don't have a well-developed beak, they've still got teeth in their jaws, they've still got a long bony tail, but they have beautiful feathers. And it's those feathers that are the soft, fluffy parts of animals that I'm interested in. So in terms of my own research, I research fossils such as these. I've worked on the soft, squishy parts of fossil frogs, which you can see one on the top left, fossil birds, top center, other squishy things that might be vertebrates, might be cephalopods, we're not quite sure yet. I've worked on lots of fossil insects, some feathered dinosaurs, snakes, bats, mammals, you name it. If it's got soft parts, chances are I've looked at some of those kinds of fossils. Really though, when I think about what really gets me interested, I'm interested in the skin. I'm interested in our integument, how that has evolved over the last 500 million years. Because if you think about it, the integument is the barrier between our lovely, stable, homeostatically controlled internal environment and all the nasty, horrible stuff that exists outside. Swings in temperature, changes in humidity, you know, spiky things that can actually pierce you, things trying to infect you. Our skin, our integument is what protects us from all of those external influences. So I'm really interested in how the skin has evolved and also things that poke out of the skin. So feathers and hair, horns and claws, all that kind of stuff. So that's my fluff, and that's what I'm really, really interested in. Because if you think about it, all of that stuff is what has enabled us, what has enabled vertebrate life on our planet to move from aquatic environments onto dry land. If you want to survive on dry land, you've got to get your ass in gear, you've got to sort out your integument. It's really critical tissue in terms of, you know, evolution of our ancestors. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is just to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of fossils we've looked at in terms of, you know, fluff, and also, you know, what kind of interesting insights it's given us about animal bodies and about animal behavior and things like that. So we're going to start off by going to Spain virtually for the time being. We're going to look at this 10 million year old snake This is from a rural site in Spain called Libros. It's a bit weird. The site name means books in Spanish. I never did find out why, even though I spent months there in the field. It's just called books. So we went to books, and we looked at some of the fossils there. Lots of fossil frogs, but they're not the focus today. I want to talk about this snake. If you take, a close look, you can see the backbone down along the middle. You can see the ribs. The head, unfortunately, isn't preserved. It's broken off. But you can see that there is some kind of cruddy stuff in between all of the ribs. That cruddy stuff, we suspected, was actually fossil skin. We took a close look at it with the microscope, and we could see that it definitely shows some kind of overlapping structures that are reminiscent of scales. So we got permission to take some samples. There's nothing as terrifying as taking samples of the only 10 million-year-old snake that there is from northern Spain, cutting it up with a scalpel, taking very, very small pieces, and then studying it with electron microscopes. And when we did that, we found that there was some amazing preservation of its tissue structure, of the structure of the skin. Here's a look at one of those SEM shots. You can see there's some kind of wavy, sinuous fibers at the bottom. Those are collagen fibers, just like we have in our skin, the stretchy stuff, basically. But you can just start to make out some kind of little blobs up towards the top. We'll take a closer look at those blobs. These are actually fossil pigment cells embedded within the collagen fibers. And we actually found evidence for 3 types of pigment cells that, in terms of their size and shape and their internal structure, are identical to the 3 types of pigment cells that we see in the skin of modern snakes and lizards and even amphibians. And so we went then and we wondered, gosh, if we're preserving the pigment cells, can we say something about the color of this fossil snake? So we looked at pigment cells in modern snakes and reptiles, and we were able to actually, figure out which combinations of pigment cells produced different types of visual colors, depending on whether you've got lots of pigment cells producing melanin, a dark pigment, or pigment cells producing lots of carotenoids, which can produce yellow, reds, or greens, depending on the situation. And, we also looked at the modern relatives of these fossil snakes. The modern relatives of these fossil snakes have these characteristic blotchy patterns. Sometimes they're spots, sometimes they're chevrons, sometimes they're just random blotches, but they all have this general green background. And we discovered with the fossils that the particular combination of the pigment cells was actually producing different colors in different parts of the body. We had evidence for dark browns and blacks. We had evidence for a pale belly. And we also had evidence for bright to dark greens. So because we weren't able to sample the entire fossil snake, we can't tell you if our fossil snake had diamonds or spots or stripes or some weird tessellated pattern that's unknown today. But we can say that it did have combinations of those colors on its body with this pale ventral body. So it may have looked something like this. This is not intended to be an accurate, completely accurate reconstruction, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of colors that it had. So what does it tell us? It tells us, well, number one, this fossil was counter-shaded. It was using coloration for camouflage. That classic combination of a dark back and pale belly is to break up the body outline. The green coloration was almost definitely used for camouflage to blend in with vegetation. And the fact that it had some quite really bright, rather luminous green colors, these in some modern snakes are actually used in sexual display. So the colors may have actually had multiple functions. And ultimately, what the fossil tells us is that the fossil record has the potential to preserve diverse types of color producing structure and give us really accurate pictures of the shades and hues of different fossil creatures. So I'm going to move away from skin now, and I'm going to start talking about some fluffier stuff. And I suppose I better explain myself and, why am I so interested in fluffy things, in particular feathers? Well, here's a peacock feather, and here's a close-up under the light microscope. these are just remarkable structures. Feathers are actually the most complex anatomical structure that modern vertebrates are able to produce in their integument. They have this hierarchy of branches. They have, a central shaft called the rachis or quill that subdivides into barbs. The barbs subdivide into barbules, and then the barbules are even different depending on which side of the barb you're on. So they're really complex structures, and modern birds use them for all kinds of functions. They use them for insulation, they use them for camouflage, they use them to produce sound, they use them to retain air, they use them for hydrodynamics, lots of different functions. So I'm really interested in how feathers have evolved. And you might say, well, why don't you just go study Archaeopteryx? You already told us Archaeopteryx has feathers. And yeah, sure, we could do that. The problem is that Archaeopteryx is a bird. It's a bird. And even though it's the oldest bird, it has feathers that are effectively identical to modern bird feathers. So the oldest bird doesn't give us any useful information about ancient feathers and how they evolved, because they look just like the feathers of modern birds. So this tells us if we want to know how feathers evolved, we've got to go back into looking at older parts of that ancestry. We've got to look at the ancestors of birds to try and understand how feathers have evolved. So here's a very simplified evolutionary tree showing birds up there on the top right. Now, I just do need to make the point that birds are a type of dinosaur. So when I talk about birds, I actually am talking about dinosaurs. So showing birds and their other dinosaurian relatives. And at the very base of the tree, you'll see that we have a split between our basal archosaur, between all the dinosaurs on one side and our pterosaurs on the other. So if the first bird doesn't tell us anything useful about feather evolution, well, then we've got to start looking down the tree. We've got to look at these other types of dinosaurs and maybe even in pterosaurs. If I had made that statement 30 years ago, you would have said, bah, humbug, balderdash, complete nonsense. Well, things have changed over the last 30 years. And we now realize that dinosaurs were a lot furrier, a lot more feathery than we had previously thought. The classic example is, of course, Sinosauropteryx. This was the first dinosaur that was ever reported with some kind of potential integumentary covering. It's that brown, fluffy stuff down along the back of the neck and down along the back and the tail. Here's a closer look. And here is our first real close-up look at fossil fluff. Here's what that fluff looks like in close-up. You can see, you could just about convince yourself that it looks kind of hairy. You can see some individual filaments, yep, just like a horse's mane. It's a bit of a stretch to be calling this feathers though. And actually, when these were first reported, a lot of people thought that these were actually just collagen fibers from the skin. So there was a bit of a race to try and figure out, well, are these really some kind of primitive feather or are they something else? So colleagues of mine in the University of Bristol, they looked at these with, and UCD, shout out to Paddy Orr in Dublin if he's listening. They looked at these fossils with the electron microscope and they found some enigmatic little rounded features. Now, it turns out that these little rounded features are pretty much identical in terms of their size and their shape and their packing to little ball-shaped features that we see in the feathers of modern birds. These are called melanosomes. These are granules of the pigment melanin. And what's even more interesting, not even do these kind of constitute really good evidence that those fluff in Sinosauropteryx are feathers, they can actually tell us something about the color of those feathers, because in modern bird feathers, the shape of those melanosomes is different depending on the type of color that they produce in the feathers, the type of melanin pigment that they contain. And it turns out that the sausage-shaped melanosomes produce dark brown, black colors, and the round, football-shaped melanosomes produce ginger colors. And so our fossil Sinosauropteryx, it had little micro balls in its feathers. So it was a redhead. So this is the first scientifically accurate reconstruction of a dinosaur. Yes, it is effectively a ginger dinosaur. Yeah. So that's all very well and good. But do these tell us anything about the evolution of feathers? Well, Sinosauropteryx is a coelurosaur. So it's one of those dinosaurs that's actually really closely related to birds. It's right up there at the top of that evolutionary tree. What about other dinosaurs? Did they have feathers? For a long time, we thought no. And actually, for about 20 years, we thought that feathers only evolved in the very latter steps of dinosaur evolution, just as, just before birds evolved. But then a few years ago, myself and some colleagues from Russia and some from Belgium, we started working on a little dinosaur called Calindrodromeus from the very far east of Siberia. Now, you would not want to go to this place where Calindrodromeus is from, today at least. I was there in November, 7 months pregnant, and it was minus 40 degrees.